I ended up going down to Ocala. I called up Mona and told her I'd found God, and she came back and we went down to Ocala. At the same time, however, I had to recognize the fact that something had happened. Something pretty amazing had happened, and something that is happening to these other people. There was no way to deny that. And therefore, I was still in the game. I had not finished with my experiment. It wasn't over, because there was always the chance that there might have been something real about that vision. So I went down to Ocala, and I got a job down there teaching in a grade school, teaching third grade math. And I entered into a process which in the ancient church was called the catechumenate. And it involved forgiving everyone that had hurt me, asking forgiveness of people that I'd hurt, confessing my sins to the priest there at the church. It was not a Catholic church. Confessing my sins, reading scripture, hanging out with other Christians, having hands laid upon me for exorcism or deliverance, and for the healing of my heart. So the guy down in Ocala, who was the rector of this parish down there, told me, this is what you do if you want to find out more about God. And I said, okay, I'll do that. So they began to pray for me. And he began to cast demons out of me. And they came out of me in waves. And there were like 3 major waves. Like, for example, one time I was sitting at a table, and there was a young lady across from me, and all of a sudden I felt like this wave, this wall suddenly hit me from the left, and my perception suddenly changed, and I looked at her. She seemed like she was absolutely glowing, and let's say her name is Jane. I looked at her and I said, Jane, you look absolutely wonderful. And I said it in such a convincing, astounded fashion that she just kind of lit up. And Al Durrance, the priest there, was out of town, so I had about a 3-day brutal battle against lust. It just so happened my wife was out of town, and Al Durrance came back and cast the thing out of me. That was one of the big ones. Another one was that, and when these waves would come, here's what happened is a wave of evil, I'd go down into myself. I would experience these things that had been there all along, but I had not been fully aware of them. I knew I'd had enough intimations in my life to know they were there. I just didn't know what they were or didn't know how to identify them, and they were never fully visible. They were the things that were twisting and distorting my perceptions, leading me in certain directions, giving me electric power to do certain kinds of things, and subtly, steadily seeking to destroy me. So I would enter down into one of these things. They would well up inside of me. They would become utterly real. I would see what they were. I would know where they came from. I would see that they had been nurtured and abetted by committing certain types of sin, like the lust one was, of course, just committing adultery and sinning with various women. And then I would repent of those sins. I would offer them to Jesus. They would become incredibly powerful. I would have a brutal battle, and then they'd be cast out of me. Then I'd be semi-peaceful, but never really peaceful. I was kind of in hell the whole time. That's what I said in the beginning of this talk about hell. I was in hell. This experience I'm telling you about was a living hell. There's no other way to describe it. Horrible things happening to me. The best I ever felt was severely depressed. It took all my strength to get up in the morning and go forward. Another time I remember I mentioned there was nerves that I had when I was in high school. It started happening to me, something awful. It was like about 1 o'clock at night. I ran down to the church. It's probably more like about 11 because I had a job at this point teaching. I ran down to the church. The church was always open. It's only about 3 blocks from my house. I ran down the aisle. I fell in front of the altar. And all of a sudden, I screamed out as loud as I could. I thought I was going to die. I was having these electrical feelings off my body. I was just nuts. Horrible things were happening. And then suddenly I screamed, and suddenly I was like kind of back to normal. And I stood up and I looked down at my body, and I looked so clean and fair and tall and good. And what it was an evil spirit that told me my whole life I was nothing but a Caliban. I was an ugly monster. And no matter how many girls I ended up with, no matter how many people I could get to fall in love with me, I was always a monster. There was a game I used to play with my wife called Monster Man. I would go in the lake and I would be down under the water, and I would come up out of the water and I'd see her on the shore. I'd say, young lady, help me. She would cry out, Monster Man, come out, help me, come out, I love you, come out, Monster Man. And then I would sink back down underneath the water, down into the cold and the green, because I was never, ever able to stop being a monster. And after that, I used to look in the mirror and make monster faces to myself, and after that, I never pretended to be a monster again. And ever since then, I have felt like there was something fair about me. I remember when I was like my third year in grad school, when I first met Mona, we were hanging out with these guys one time. This guy was a guitar player. I used to play the guitar too. Only a tramp was Lazarus that day when he went to lie down by the rich man's cafe. He begged for crumbs from the rich man to eat, but they left him to die there like a tramp on the street. He was some mother's darling, somebody's son. Once he was fair, yes, once he was young. Somebody rocked him, little baby, to sleep, but they left him to die there like a tramp on the street. I remember how that song just had this incredible impact on me, because I was Lazarus, a tramp on the street. Remember the most ferocious one of all, and this one just, after it was cast out, it just watched over me for about 3 weeks, but this one was the killer. This was the worst. And then there was a bunch of stuff that I just couldn't even understand what it was that came out. There's a lot of little things. I have been filled with such a high level of rage. I had 3 people praying for me, 3 principal people. Al Durrance, the priest there, Lillian Updike, and Marsha Brown. And they were my father and mothers in God. And between the 3 of them, I received so much love from Jesus through them. Because every one of these prayers that they prayed for me were in the name of Jesus. Everything they asked that would happen to my soul was that Jesus would do it. But Al Durrance later said that he had never met, and that guy was a well-known exorcist. He's traveled all over this country. He was the senior North American warden of the Order of St. Luke, which is a healing order. And he's prayed for healing for many people who've been healed physically as well as spiritually, like I was being healed. I didn't have anything wrong with my body to speak of. But he said I had more rage than anybody he had ever met. It was stratospheric. And the only way I got it out of there was to forgive. And I mean, not just say, Mom, I forgive you, or Daddy, I forgive you, or girl from Florida, I forgive you, or girl from here, I forgive you. I had to forgive these people, and I had to forgive myself. And on some of these people, I had to go back and ask for forgiveness for. But I had to forgive specific things. I forgive you from the time you slapped me when Jack dropped the mercurochrome. I forgive you for the time you blew me off when I tried to say you didn't love me. I forgive you for the time you enslaved me and cheated me when we painted the house and it took forever. You only paid us $12, paid me $12.50 for many, many hours and hours of work. On and on and on. Specific, concrete things. And then we had to cast out a lot of little stuff before we got to the big stuff. And finally, that thing got cast out of me. Spirit of Antichrist is what they called it. And the logic of the thing is very simple. If you don't love me, you deserve to die. and I'm going to kill you. And if you hurt these other people, you deserve to die, and I'm going to kill you. That's the spirit that Dostoevsky was writing about in his book, The Possessed. It is a ferocious spirit that dominates this world. And there is not a country on earth that is exempt. Once a country gets enough weapons, they begin to utilize that spirit, and it twists their perceptions, and they start doing evil things. Always. It just seems always to happen. Only exception is the kingdom of God, and I'll get to that later. Anyway, they cast that thing out. I was so happy when that was gone. One last thing that happened. I don't want to spend forever talking about this, but you'll understand now why I believe in Jesus, and later why I believe in God, because I did all this without believing in God. I believed in Jesus after a while, that he was a powerful spirit, because he was doing things. It's all done in his name. I believe he existed. I didn't believe God existed, because I never experienced anything from God. Sometimes I get these faint impressions of God, but they were never good. They were always evil. I thought it couldn't be God. I know what it was. I remember one other time this is probably the time when I was in the worst agony of all. I'll never forget how horrific that was. And you know what? It was not just the physical pain. The physical pain was horrendous. It was the anguish. There's this inner anguish, as if I was looking up to being loved and just was being continuously kicked in the face. And the thoughts that were going through my head, just blasting through. And electrical feelings were coming out of my hands. The thoughts that were blasting through my head were obscenities beyond imagination. I can't even repeat them to you. I've only told 2 other people, and I told them just to get them off my mind. And I was in hell. And it was getting worse and worse and worse, and I ran down to the church by myself again. I got within about 6 feet of the church, and all of a sudden I had this impression that whoever was tormenting me could take me off the rack of torment and put somebody else in my place. And I screamed out with utter intensity, and I meant every word of it, put it on Jesus. And I wanted him to die. And I was instantly healed. I was taken off the rack of torture, and somebody was put in my place. After that, I understood Isaiah 53, where it says, by his wounds we are healed. The iniquity of us all was laid upon him. After that, I started believing that Jesus was real, because he was experienced. I was experiencing him. I still didn't know about God. Finally, after about 1.5 years of this hell, I just couldn't take it any longer. I remember I was reading St. John of the Cross. I meant to bring the book, and I forgot to bring it. I brought along several of my other books. Also brought along this book, which I forgot to show you, The Power Elite. It's one of the books I read in my more Marxist period. Just shows you how a small elite is basically running things. I'm not going to comment on that right now, except to say a lot of the political ideas that I developed in those days, I've modified somewhat, a little more fair-minded about things. But everything I've studied, and I've studied a lot since then, many years of study, I haven't seen a whole lot to convince me that powerful, evil people run the world, and that a lot of good people get in power, but there are also a lot of corruption. The United States is a mixture of good and evil, like many other countries. But enough said on that topic. But I couldn't take it anymore, and I read St. John of the Cross. And St. John of the Cross says, when you go through the dark night of the soul, there'll be a time when you can come out. And I remember thinking, and I put down the book, and I think, my time has got to come to an end. I started reading one of the Psalms. It's one of the Psalms where the psalmist just cries out to God, God, have mercy on me. Have mercy on me, God. And I remember I was crying. I needed help. I went to bed that night. And that night I had a dream. I dreamed I was in the Church of Christ as a kid. And I knew in the dream that if I stayed there terrible things were going to happen to me. So my brother and I both got up during the worship service, and we went out the door. And we went out onto the street, and we looked to our right, and there were these evil beings out there, and they were sort of a cross between a greyhound and a human. They looked kind of like humans, but their faces were sort of shrouded. They were very lean. They were about 5'8", 5'10" in height. Very lean, had an intense, very acute sense of smell, and they were hideously vicious. They were extremely clever and cunning in an evil sort of way, but that's the only form of intelligence they had. And they started after us, and we took off to the left running. We passed over a railroad track. Jack went right, I went straight. And I ran as fast as I could, and they were coming behind me, and I got to this house filled with these wonderful women, and I went into the house trying to get away from the creatures, and the ladies in there told me that I had nothing to worry about, that they had put pepper down around the house, and that these creatures would not be able to smell that I was in there. I said, okay. So I was just kind of settled down in there, and I was starting to have a wonderful time with these young ladies. And after a little bit, I began to get the impression that maybe these young ladies really didn't quite know what was going on, and that maybe a couple of them were actually in league with these things, and that what they had told me might not be the truth. And then I began to see that they hadn't told me the truth. So I ran down the basement. By this time, the creatures were coming into the house, and down in the basement there was a car. It had some children in it. I jumped into the car, started up. The garage door, basement garage door went up, and I drove out going full blast. And I'm driving as fast as I could. And then I discovered the brakes didn't work. I was going through red lights and everything else and traffic. I figured I was going to die. And the kids were laughing and jumping around, which reminds me when this process of going through the dark night and I was getting prayed for, I was hanging out with this group of us that were down there in Ocala, Florida. We had the most wonderful times, the most amazing conversations. It was amazing. By 5 o'clock in the afternoon, it seemed like we had been up for hours. We were getting so many insights and figuring out so many things. My cousin B.E. came down to see me. He had dropped acid and gotten divorced and was a zombie. And he got prayed for one time, and this hideous empty feeling that he had inside of him that was killing him instantly disappeared. He was in a state of shock and gave his life to Christ. And he and I and others, Ralph Penland was there. We had a fabulous time, but it was hell. We were in hell, but it was fabulous. Anyway, the kids were having a great time in the car, and that's what it was about. We were roaring down the street. Finally, I ran out of gas, jumped out of the car, came to a place I'd been before. The previous time I'd gone left. This time I went straight, got on a train. It's a commuter train like the ones they have in Chicago, the L. It was kind of moving along, and I looked down about 4 or 5 rows down there. There was a guy reading the paper, and I realized he was kind of had it like this. I realized it was one of those creatures. The train stopped. I get off the train, go down some steps, cross a very busy street, go into an apartment building, go to the second floor, not go through a door, and inside this empty room, it's empty except for a chair and a suit of clothes on the chair. So I start taking off my clothes and putting on the new clothes. I then look up through the window. I see at the roof of a building across the street a sniper, one of those creatures with a high-powered rifle. He fires. The bullet comes through the window and hits the foot of a cross that was in the room that I hadn't seen. I finish putting on the new clothes, walk out of the room, shut the door, go down the street, and I'm utterly invisible. And a terrible hell that had afflicted me from my childhood disappeared. And it never returned. Ever. Now, I've had a lot of struggles as a Christian life because somebody with my background doesn't always fit in to quote-unquote official religion. But that kind of hell never came back. I've had some tough things happen, but that hell never came back. After that, I began to believe in Jesus. And I began to think that he loved me, because he'd been willing to take my suffering. Then we moved to Jacksonville, and I started teaching in a high school. We were there for 2 years. And Al Durrance, the priest there in Ocala, wanted me to go to seminary, and I said, okay, I'll do it. And the main reason I wanted to go was I wanted to find more about this. This was incredibly interesting. This is one of the most interesting things this was far and away the most interesting thing that I'd ever been involved in. So I want to know more about this. So I became what they call a postulant. You have to go to the diocese and you have to take a bunch of tests. They gave me a whole battery of psychological tests, and I did fine. Passed all the tests. Had a little trouble with one of the psychiatrists when he asked me my religious experience. I started telling him. He found it a little hard to believe. I didn't tell him everything, but I told him enough to make him nervous. But they sort of had their doubts about that guy, apparently. So they sent me to a second. I'd already had a bunch of tests by an earlier psychologist who tested me all day long, with all these tests of different kinds and interviews and everything else. Sent me to another psychiatrist, and he said, I told him the same thing I told the first one. He said, that's nothing to worry about. He thought I looked pretty sane to him. Anyway, I went to seminary. I became president of the junior class and president of the student body, and I did really, really well in seminary academically, speaking, and I was kind of their golden boy in a certain way up to a point. Although I found out very fast, very quickly, that if I told them what had really happened to me, I would have never gotten in the first place. And that would have been that. But be that as it may, I was sane, and they knew that, and people liked me, and I had a way with people. But before I went to seminary, I was sitting there on the couch one day talking to Mona, and it became clear to me that I did not believe that Jesus was the Son of God. And I'll come back to that theme, but I need to tell you one other thing. But first, that summer, after the first year I was in Jacksonville teaching, I spent the summer on the porch. I was a teacher, so I had the summer off, and I spent the summer on the porch praying and waiting for the Lord to speak to me, because I didn't know what I was doing with my life. I remember reading this poem and hearing this song that even before I became a Christian sort of made sense to me. It went kind of like this. I must have heard it after I became a Christian. I'm just a fallen leaf in the wind, Lord. Please, before I hit the ground, give me a life 'cause I'm dying. I don't know why I've been around. Anyway, that's kind of the way I felt. And I didn't know what I was doing, so I thought I'd sit on that front porch the whole summer. I sat there 5 or 6 hours a day waiting for the Lord. And he actually did come to me one time, kind of blew on me for an instant. But nothing much happened, except I got to doing some serious thinking. And two things happened. The first one happened before I went to Jacksonville and got the job. I forgot about something. The whole time that I was having these demons cast out of me, and that Jesus was healing my heart, taking my suffering, I never once experienced love from God. I felt like Jesus had loved me because he'd done loving things for me, although I never felt any love from him directly. But I never felt any love from God, and so I didn't believe that God existed. But along the way, it was like I began to get these really simple ideas. And it seemed like, kind of in retrospect, that maybe God was talking to me, because they were really simple ideas. It was as if God was saying, look, Rob, you don't know why the innocent suffer. You don't really know fully understand what was going on when that little boy was put in the privy. Now, it could be the devil did it and I let him, or that I have some other plan, or you don't really understand that. Or maybe I'm not impotent, or maybe I'm not omnipotent, or maybe I'm not all love. But let me ask you a simple question. Do you or do you not want to receive love from me? This is if God himself, the creator of the universe, the God, the one that can do things about everything. So if he were talking to me, he said, do you want to receive love from me? And about that time, I've been reading the Bible because I found it was really interesting, because all the things that were happening to me, a lot of them were in the Bible. And about that time, I read a verse in the Bible that made a whole lot of sense to me. Well, not a lot of sense. Yeah, it made sense. And it went like this. This is in John chapter 14, verse 22. Then Judas, not Judas Iscariot, said, Lord, that is Jesus, why do you intend to show yourself to us and not to the world? Jesus is talking about he's going to be crucified, but he's going to return, or he's be raised from the dead, and he will reveal himself to him. He said, so Judas says, are you going to reveal yourself to us and not to the world? Great question. Which to my mind means, is he just going to reveal himself to the apostles and not to me, or you, or anybody? Jesus replied, if anyone loves me, he will obey my teaching. That's what I was doing. I was trying to obey his teaching. Everything I was doing. Forgiveness, being forgiven, laying on of hands for deliverance, Holy Eucharist, study, fellowship, It's all right here in the Bible. That was his teaching. He taught all of that. If anyone loves me, he will obey my teaching. My Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him. Now, when I read that, I thought to myself, whoa, if that's true, if God the Father himself, the God, will come to me and make his home with me and love me, then maybe I might know whether he exists or not. So I remember, when the Lord, or whatever it was, my own thinking said, you don't know the issue of theodicy, that is why the innocent suffer, but are you willing to be loved? I thought about it a little while, and I said, yes, I'm willing to be loved. So anyway, we went up to Jacksonville, and we were sitting on the porch, and I was praying all summer, and I got to thinking. And I got to thinking about the vision that I had of the wrath of God, where I thought God was going to destroy the world, and the things that had happened to me with regard to Jesus. And I also read the varieties of religious experience, because this whole time I was reading books all the time. I always have, and I have ever since, by William James. And William James is America's foremost philosopher. He's also America's foremost student of religious experience. And he studies religious experience from a scientific point of view. That is, he documents religious experiences, reflects on them, and draws conclusions, as any good scientist would. And here is his conclusion, which can be found in the postscript of his varieties of religious experience. And here's what he has to say. If one should make a division of all thinkers into naturalists and supernaturalists, I would undoubtedly have to go, along with most philosophers, into the supernaturalist branch. That is, he believes that there is a supernatural world, and things live in that world and impact us. Naturalism believes that the only world that exists is the one we can touch, feel with our senses. So he's a supernaturalist. But there's a crasser and a more refined supernaturalism, and it's to the refined division that most philosophers of the present day belong. If not regular transcendental idealists, they at least obey the Kantian direction enough to bar out ideal entities from interfering causally in the course of phenomenal events. Now, referring to Kant, I don't want to go into this, but when I was getting my PhD in theology, I made a study of Schleiermacher, who was heavily influenced by Kant. And basically Kant says, even if God were to interact in the world, we couldn't know it was God. And so Schleiermacher developed a theology in which God did not interact with the world, but God could only be known mystically. He called it the feeling of absolute dependence. And being an intellectual, James knows all about that, but that's refined supernaturalism, and James doesn't believe it. I don't believe it either. I don't see any difference by Occam's razor, as far as I'm concerned. Refined supernaturalism of the Schleiermacher, Tillich, Macquarie sort is no different from naturalism, in my view. Anyway, so he doesn't agree. He's not a refined supernaturalism. James didn't. Supernaturalism. Then he goes on to say, he believes in what he calls crass or piecemeal supernaturalism. It went with that older theology, which today is supposed to reign only among uneducated people, or to be found among the few belated professors of the dualism which Kant has thought to have displaced. It admits miracles and providential leadings, and finds no intellectual difficulty in mixing the ideal and the real worlds together by interpolating influences from the ideal region among the forces that causally determine the world's details. That's what he calls crass or piecemeal supernaturalism. There are forces out there that impinge upon the finite world and make a difference in matters of fact. He goes on to say a little bit more about that. And he has to say this, talking about piecemeal supernaturalism. He also says this: the whole drift of my education goes to persuade me that the world of our present consciousness is only one out of many worlds of consciousness that exist, and that those other worlds must contain experiences which have a meaning for our life also. And that although in the main their experiences and those of this world keep discrete, yet the two become continuous at certain points, and higher energies filter in. By being faithful in my poor measure to this overbelief, I seem to myself to be more sane and true. I can, of course, put myself into the sectarian scientist attitude and imagine vividly that the world of sensation, of scientific laws and objects may be all. That is all that exists. But whenever I do this, whenever I start thinking that this world is all that exists, I hear that inward monitor of which W.K. Clifford once wrote, whispering the word bosh. Humbug is humbug, even though it bear the scientific name, and the total expression of human experience, as I view it, objectively, invincibly urges me beyond the narrow, quote-unquote, scientific bounds. Now, I read that. I thought about that. And then I thought about what happened to me when I was thinking about determinism and free will. And I thought about the fact that I had made a decision that whatever I experience is what is real. James, on the basis of religious experience, the experiences of religious people, decided there's a supernatural world that affects us. I had experienced that supernatural world. After reading William's James and sitting on the porch, I decided that Jesus existed. It was obvious.